Okay, I got the message too. Good morning. Happy Thursday. Welcome to Thursdays with Culture Talk. I am Cynthia Forstman, dialed in from Denver, Colorado, and I am excited to be joined by my partner in crime, my sister, my co-founder, Teresa. Say hello
Good
from...
morning from Saratoga Springs, New York.
Yeah.
Happy spring. Happy April.
Yeah, we were just talking, I guess I have a spring color, but here in Denver, we've had weather that's gotten a little chillier again, hopefully warming up and moving us into spring. If you are new to Culture Talk and the work we're doing, the conversation we're having, as the name of our company suggests, we talk about all things related to organizational culture. And, connected to that topic, there's so many things. There's teams, there's, brands, there's leaders, there's hiring, there's engaging, all of these topics that kind of in the center point are around culture. And specifically the work we do is helping organizations and the teams that work with leaders to make culture something that becomes tangible. Right? It's easy to talk about culture and feel like you're talking about the air in the room, but how do you create a culture conversation that really can, connect people, drive strategy? That's the kind of work that we do at Culture Talk. And we get together like this every Thursday morning. We tackle different conversations in that space, which is pretty wide. And we thought today it might be fun just to do, I'm going to call it a potluck, Teresa, kind of a FAQ potluck, in all the conversations we have with people that are curious, that are maybe handed the culture torch and said, go, and they're kind of like, how do I even
go where?
Yeah, how do I even get started? What is this conversation all about? So we invited people to send us their questions. We also have a couple of questions that, we hear often. And so I'm gonna bounce some questions off of Teresa. Let's have a conversation. And I'm gonna start, Teresa, with one that I didn't mention. I'm gonna throw you off.
Okay, that's right. See if I know the answers. I know.
Let's see how good you are. Okay. So even before what is culture? What is organizational culture?
Yeah. So we like to think about culture as the unwritten rules of engagement. Another way of thinking about that is it is the difference, the delta between what you say you expect and what you actually tolerate. That's really intriguing. I think that thinking about it like that really drives you to think of your own stories and experiences as they relate to culture. Because it's easy to say, okay, culture is the way we do things around here, right? So that has become one way of describing it. And certainly that's true. But what is the way we do things around here? We have written, documented expectations. Maybe they're in the employee handbook, or, we hear about them at orientation, or during a big company event, the leader gets up and talks about, well, this is the way we do things around here.
Yeah.
Those are the stated expectations, and great, that's a part of it. But then what actually happens? And so I really love this idea of pausing to think about, well, what do we actually tolerate? What do we reward? What are the stories and experiences that unite us and are the commonalities of our shared experience? And there, I think, is where the culture really lies, sort of underneath the surface a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it's important that we have a way to get to those things.
Yeah, and I just want to hone in on one thing you said when you talk about the delta, the gap between what we say and what we tolerate. I think that's also a space that we're a little bit blind to, right? We kind of can't, especially, the people that are putting together the conversation around culture.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the leadership team, maybe it's the HR team. And,
we believe our own rhetoric a lot of times.
Yeah. And when people get really frustrated is when they experience the difference, right? We said
Yeah,
this, but I'm having an experience that's different. And
right. And
so
therein lies sort of like
yeah,
this moral chasm, right? Of the
mhm,
difference between what you said and what you did.
yeah,
The word integrity is thrown around a lot,
yeah,
but if you state some things to be true and to be, behaviors that we expect, and then we reward and recognize, or we undermine, then we have a lack of integrity. And there's that difference again.
yeah. I'm going to add one more thought on what is culture, because a lot of times there are people now that are being assigned. You are going to be the culture committee. You're going to be
Right.
in charge of culture. It may be HR, it may be learning
Right.
and development, it may be a mixed kind of team. And there is that aspect of culture, to your point of like kind of outlining who are we, what are we all about, what do we expect? And so, in that way, when we're defining what the culture is going to be, there's sort of an input. But
Mm.
culture, if you flip that on its head, is really more of an output. So, the decisions we make every day, how we get work done, what we prioritize when we budget, all of those things that are part of like the system and the organization operating are actually creating that shared experience. So you can kind of think about it as, yes, an input is great. That's the expectation, but it's really every decision you ever make as a leader, as a team, is contributing, right? And putting part of the experience together for people. So another
That's
one.
really rich. I like that. I like that analogy.
Mm,
As you were talking about that, it reminded me sort of like a web. Like we are constantly weaving this
yeah.
web. It's live. And we have opportunities to, contribute to it in a positive way that moves us forward, if we so choose.
Yeah. A living, breathing thing. We can't ignore it. I've heard people say too, you know, whether you have any intention around the culture you're creating or not, the
Mm,
culture is still getting created,
that's right.
right?
So whether you've
So
got the torch or not, exactly.
yeah, or if you
I think
handed it to somebody, you just dropped the thing that dropped the
Yeah,
thing.
well, we took care of that. Check. We gave so and so the job of handling the culture. Maybe it's a leader,
Yeah.
is why it's a real connection between leadership and culture.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about
Okay.
the connection, because we hear that a lot. Isn't the leadership team like responsible? What do you think about that?
Well, I'd say yes, absolutely. The leadership team bears an enormous amount of weight for the culture and for bringing awareness to the culture. And, I always think sometimes you have assessments that kind of look at, well, what's going on in the culture? And they ask everybody the question and then kind of weight their responses, and
Mhm.
do some math equation to figure out, well, what our culture is all about. But
Right.
I think that misses the important element that the leaders carry more weight. That, when they walk in the door in the morning, people are looking at them, paying attention to not what they say so much as what they do.
Mhm.
And the way that they show up matters. So I think that as a stated, way of behaving, that leaders have a huge responsibility for walking the talk,
Mm.
and communicating, and then, you know, closing that gap between what they say and what they do, but articulating and
Mm.
finding a way to consistently communicate expectations instead of leaving it to guesswork.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of the reasons I think why leadership development is also part of culture work, right? Because you have people in leadership roles who feel like that's somebody else's problem. I'm in charge of finance or I'm in
Mhm.
charge of marketing. I'm not in
Right.
charge of like how it feels to work here.
Right. We handed that off to the L&D folks.
Yeah.
Or yeah.
Right. And so some of the work we see in at Culture Talk with people doing culture work is this real focus on what are the leadership behaviors that are going to help us create that culture that we say we expect, right?
Mm.
Because the
The documentation,
behavior,
right, of those expectations again, back to that.
yeah, well, and I think also, in terms of leaders, developing leaders, helping them become aware of how are they showing up, because we like to say, your state of being is contagious. So if
Mm,
you are a leader and you're stepping into a room, you're stepping into a meeting, you're about to, get your team fired up about something, are you being intentional about who you are as a contributor, as a reflector of the shared experience we've agreed we want to create?
right. One of the most interesting aspects of that, and I think we get asked this question a lot too, is, does the way that the leader shows up, their own personality, does that become the culture?
Mm,
And I think
yeah.
it's a little tricky, right? Because
Mm.
there is we think that culture, when you go looking for it, you have to kind of be a detective. One of the things you need to look at is the origin story of the company. So what were the founders' beliefs and what was the driving forces, that made this organization come to life and gave it its, marching orders? But the leaders, whether they were the founders or not, do play kind of this outsized role. And
Mm.
yet, there can be many other contributors to the culture. So the way the leader shows up from a personality standpoint, the way their leadership style
Yeah.
is exhibited is one input. To your point earlier about input, but the mission of the organization, maybe the services or the products that are going to market, and ideally the input from all the other stakeholders. So the leader is a very important stakeholder who
Yeah.
drives a lot of the culture and has a lot of influence. And in a healthy organization, that's just one input.
Right. Well, I was just going to make two comments. One, we do see when a leader transitions, when we have new leadership come in, that the
Mhm.
mark of a particular leader, of a particular founder is all over the place, right? That's that kind
Mhm.
of outsized influence that you're talking about. And often one of the trickiest things to navigate for a new leader stepping into a culture is to, learn to read the room in terms of what is the energy and experience that's been
Mhm.
established, and how am I going to now be here in this company, in this culture, leading this team, but also bring my best self, even though I'm
Right,
clearly not the same person who just left, right?
right.
So that
Well, and
transition.
that person was tapped for a particular set of skills.
Hmm. Right.
They were recognized as the best one to lead this organization, and so they're going to bring unique things to it, which you would imagine had been desired attributes,
Right. So maybe
skills
some
that the
things that we're
organization would
lacking.
benefit from, right? So maybe there needs to be some shift.
Hmm.
But how hard that is, I think, too, you sort of painted a picture in my mind of being a new leader, stepping into someone else's domain until you make it your own and trying to figure it out, which is why it really helps to have a framework to understand what are the assumptions of this culture.
Right.
What do people base their decisions on? What are the underlying drivers they've been living to, so that when I bump into them, and I will.
I was going to say it's like there's lines, but they're invisible unless we have a way to, as we do, make that tangible. So we
Right.
understand what is that line, what are those definitions, what are
Yeah.
those behaviors.
Right. Because everybody else kind of knows, right? And they're all walking to their rhythm, whether it's been named or not, but naming it is a really good thing. And so, it's like you haven't been told the rules, maybe, especially if you're a new hire leader coming in.
Well, and people don't even think they need to tell you the rules, right? Because they're just used to how things are and how they
Mhm.
work around here. New hire is a great example, Teresa, because how many times have you walked into an organization and maybe been the new person? or like, it's like being that freshman college experience. Like you get the vibe that there's like a right way and a wrong way to do things. There's a
But
right
nobody's
thing and a
telling
wrong
you.
thing to say, but nobody can actually tell you what it's like. That it's that invisibility. But at
Yeah.
some point you start to pick up on
Yeah.
okay, now I get it. Now I know how to
Yeah.
operate and move in this culture. So
Yeah, and I love that. I love that college analogy, because if you've been to college, you come back in your sophomore year and you're
yeah.
just like, oh, thank God. Like, I'm not the new guy anymore. I know the culture. And it's unspoken. Much of it is unspoken. So how do we bring it to light? How do we make it
Well,
tangible?
right. And I'm gonna just underscore that like leaders today who are looking for a way to manage with intention the experience that is being created, this culture that is being created, they need to do it quickly. We can't wait for everybody to catch on. You know what I mean? We waste a lot of time, right? And business is moving fast. We have lots of competitors. There's high demands. We want to get our strategies moving forward. And so having a language and a way to define our culture again gives it that tangibility that makes us go, hey, Teresa, this is how it works around here. This is what we value. This is where you're stepping across the line. So let's get there more quickly,
Yeah.
right? So that we can
And
get things done.
you're pointing to another question that comes up.
Okay, which one is
And
that?
you've heard, right? Which is, can you shift a culture? And sometimes, when people are moving quickly, it's because they're shifting and changing priorities.
We're shifting all the time right now.
Yeah, they're implementing a new strategy. Maybe that aligns with the culture, or maybe the culture is what's been holding us back and keeping us from achieving some of the goals. That could be why the new leader was brought in to begin with. So what do you think about that one, Cynthia? Can you?
I have a really specific example around that. So thinking about one of our CultureTalk partners that is working with a client that is experiencing heated competition in an industry where they were kind of like it for a long time. And now there's all these little upstart companies and trying to figure out like we need to get more competitive, we need to move faster, we need to do some things differently, building a whole strategy around that, and then having a team that doesn't seem to pick up on it. And as they like start to look under the hood, get to what are those unwritten rules, what are those unconscious underlying cultural drivers, one thing that they find is that this particular culture has something we call high innocent. That's one of our culture types in the work we do at CultureTalk. And innocent has got all these beautiful things around that story, which are about simplicity and ease and
integrity and values, traditional expectations.
even kind of like a family feel to the organization, whatnot. So a lot of reasons why people stay in this particular company and culture. But the other side of it, the behavior that is also part of innocent is like, no. I don't want to know anything is bad. I don't want any conflict. I want to stay within my.
I don't want any change.
I know I don't want any change. I want to stay in my lane, which is like I know what's expected and I show up and I do it. And so, in fact, the culture was working against the strategy. And once they start to peel that onion and start to go, oh, I see. These very things that we value in our culture are actually, people don't know why they can't step into this new strategy. But that's what was happening underneath it. So is the shift possible? The culture has to support strategy or it will never happen. So making it tangible is one way that we say, yes, now we can start to see what are the beliefs, what are the behaviors, what are those unwritten rules, where are those gaps, so that we can make specific shifts with intention.
Right. And what I'm hearing in that as well is we're not saying lose the good parts of that innocence culture.
Right.
but recognize that there are, some challenges, and we call them shadows here at Culture Talk. So there's some shadows to that innocent behavior as well. I loved your na 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 na. So how do we take our fingers out of our ears and step into this change and this, need to be
Right.
more competitive and potentially more innovative and meet the demands of the industry? So stay in business. How do we stay alive without losing the integrity, without losing the family feel? And are those compatible?
Yeah.
And how can we make a strategy that supports both the business need and what the employees really like about being here?
Yeah.
So
It's the unwritten
really
assumptions, right? About things. So shift is possible.
Yeah.
I'm going to parlay that into another question we get.
Okay.
We dabbled right for a second into archetype. Archetype is the framework that we use here at Culture Talk. Teresa, give us just a quick snapshot. What is an archetype?
Okay. All right. So archetypes, and the reason why we find them so effective in this conversation around culture, are human stories. And we have a framework of 12 that we use. You could argue for additional archetypes, but having 12 gives us something manageable to work with. Archetypes and the, unconscious understanding of those storylines tie us together as human beings. So it becomes a shortcut, like a code, because as Cynthia was describing a little bit about what the innocent is all about, you probably said, oh yeah, that makes sense. Those things go hand in hand. If we were to describe another archetype pattern as the hero, we would explain that on the positive strength side of that pattern, we experience determination and the willingness and ability to reach goals and overcome obstacles and save the day and
slay dragons.
Slay dragons, right? Everything we associate with heroism. On the flip side of that, we might say that the hero culture can be too driven, that it could lead us to burnout, right? Another huge topic we could talk about in culture these days. So there's two sides to every archetype. And that's why that framework really enables us to lead meaningful conversations, because we can look at how a culture shows up when it's acting from its best self and when it's under stress. And so what are those indicators?
Shadow comes out,
right? The shadow side of the archetype that comes up when it's under stress. So those are some of the principles of archetype. So there's stories, they have strengths and shadows. And as cultures and as humans, we have access to the full range of them. But we're going to have kind of these preferences, the go-tos, the ones that are most comfortable to us. So that's where we get into this idea of, can they be measured? Can you measure the preferences, the ones we lean into, and we're on kind of a repeat in our cultures. And so when we can take a look at what are those ones, that's where we start to, use that framework and have the ability to measure and create some tangibility around culture.
So let me tie that back to the question you asked of can you shift the culture, right? We know that any change initiative starts with awareness. So if I'm looking at in my organization, what are those cultural patterns? Or I'm looking in myself, what are my archetypes? What are the storylines that are on autopilot for me? And where are those stories, helpful? Where are they moving me forward? What are the attributes of those stories that people count on me for, right? Cynthia's going to show up and she's going to do X. But also, as you develop that awareness, you become aware of the shadow. You become aware of when you've actually slipped into behavior that limits your opportunity, that gets in the way of your success. And so can you shift that? Absolutely. You can, as you develop the awareness, and we see this happen all the time with individuals going, oh, there goes my every person again. Or we see it happen with teams, right? They recognize, because they've got this common language, when did they slip? And in that moment of it can be a moment of ooh, right now I'm going to shift my behavior. I am not going to go there. I'm going to pick something that I think is a stronger way to move forward. But there's also the shift that happens over time when we identify, the gaps that exist between where we want to be and what we're doing now. We see what we're doing and we start to
Right.
see
And
more
see the outcomes of
quickly.
what we're doing and the ruts we stay in, right?
Yeah, right. And so then you see teams that go the same thing. Oh, our caregiver is on overdrive and it is hanging us up. We're not going to be, we're not going to accomplish this strategic objective if we continue to behave in this way. And so you can shift in the moment and you can shift over time by being, driven to dial up or dial down particular archetype patterns that exist in your group or in yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great strategic tool to help lead change initiatives. To begin with a foundational understanding of what are the patterns that are prevalent in our culture and are they going to serve this shift that we're trying to create? And how do we really call out and define the action steps and the behaviors that are going to drive us, to where we would like to go? So great opportunity. I think that the conversation around development, the ability to use archetypes to shift and change and develop leaders and teams is tremendous. And I think that's one of the huge benefits of starting with this underlying understanding, about culture.
Yeah, story is just rich, right? We don't have to, as human beings, teach people a story, right? We kind of are wired. And that's the idea behind archetype as well, is that it's part of our wiring as human beings to listen, to intake, to sort and categorize, to create meaning through story. And so it's simple, right? It's a simple but profound way to really get at that unconscious beliefs and behaviors that drive us. I want to shift gears. Oh, actually, I want to ask one more question, because we were just talking about can we shift culture? And a question that we also get often is like, isn't there a right culture, right? and we see
I get to the highest score.
We see all the time companies trying to imitate each other, right? Like, do you know that pattern of like, ooh, we want to be like that, we want to do that because that's going to get us
for years leading into the pandemic. Everyone was like, oh, how do we get to be like Google?
Yeah,
where everybody wants to come and work for us.
No offense, Google. Yeah, right. But is there a right culture? There's certain schools of thought that say, hey, here's the 5 things that a company that has the right culture is doing, and if you can master these 4 areas or these 5 areas and focus on these things, you'll be in the sweet spot, you'll be making money or whatever it is. We actually subscribe to the opposite idea. And that is that there is no right culture. There is the culture that exists as an output of the unique combination of individuals, leaders, business model, etc., that grew out of those things, that unique combination, and that we can optimize that. We don't have to turn it, we don't have to turn company culture A into, here's the cult, we don't have to shift it into this predetermined box of what the right culture looks like. Instead, we can really focus on how do we optimize what exists here.
Right. And ensure that we're working from the strength of the culture, as opposed to acting from the shadow sides of that culture. Because I absolutely believe there is toxic workplace culture, but that in every case, a toxic workplace culture is acting from its shadow sides, undermining its employees. And we could have a whole conversation about what's a toxic workplace culture. So I think that there is toxicity. However, the unique combination that you've talked about, Cynthia, makes every culture different. Right. And that's a good thing. And it makes it a right match for certain people. And that's a good thing too.
Well, did you know I was going to move next? So we did get a couple of questions that came in, and specifically around kind of brand, employment brand, hiring, some of the DEI things that are really important now. So what I'd like to do is shift to how do we use our culture in hiring?
Mm. Well, I think
Can
that
we
there's,
use our culture in hiring?
yeah, I think that at its foundation, we can use our culture to establish a brand, an employment brand
Mhm.
that aligns with what it really feels like to work here. That's an honest reflection of what we're committed to, what we're passionate about, how people feel in their day-to-day experience with our company. And that if we can get that message fine-tuned, that we can use it as one of the most impactful recruiting tools that we have. There's
Mm.
this great lamenting going on, the great, resignation, reshuffle, whatever you want to call it, where people are saying, I'm not a fit here. I'm not a fit here for whatever reason. So they're looking up and saying, well, where would I like to go? Where would I like to be? And if you create as an employer a message and a consistency, not a made up,
Yeah.
painted on expression of what we think it should be like, but an honest, authentic reflection of what it really is like. And an honest, meaning we'll tell you the things that are challenging here, as well as the things we're working on and how we're committed to working on those, and the positive aspects of our culture, which
Mm.
we've heard over and over again. Employees don't expect perfection,
No.
but they really want to know that you
Intention.
acknowledge,
Yeah.
right? And that you're working on the things that are challenging for you and for your culture.
Yeah. I think part of this whole period of time we're in too is about like being human at work, right?
Mm,
There is no perfect human. There is no perfect workplace culture. There is no perfect team, no perfect leader. But when we invest in building the awareness about the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? That all exist as part of the continuum
here we
anyway,
are.
right? Here it is. I can't get away with we all have traits that people get on people's nerves, right? And so that self-awareness and framing it in a human story that we're just human, we're not perfect, but we're trying.
Mm,
And I love that experience of that employment brand example. We have a number of partners in our CultureTalk network, partner network, who actually do work on that employment brand, or even
right.
what you might consider more of the corporate brand, using the framework of archetype and using this kind of inside out, where first we're going to measure the culture that exists in this organization so that that story is authentic and
Right.
truly reflects who we are. And you just can't fake it, right? I remember one Susan Radaminsky, if you're here, Susan, hello, using the expression that we're always like in marketing and branding, we're always so focused on differentiators. It's really hard
That's right.
to define different, like to find those differentiators, but authentic. Why instead are we not focused on finding out who we authentically are? Because that can't even be imitated. And that who we
And
are
it's the quickest
authentically.
path to differentiation anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's
Yeah.
exactly the point she made around that.
Yeah.
So yes, employment brand as one aspect of
Yeah.
hiring.
Yeah. And I have another thought on hiring.
Yeah.
So if you are intentional about looking at the recruits you bring in, and in the interview process, maybe at the second interview stage, once you kind of culled out the field a little bit and you're more serious about people, and you look to understand who's the human being sitting in front of me, and does their way of thinking and showing up and what motivates them and what they're passionate about, would that be a good addition to our team? Not, is it a direct match for our culture, but does the energy they bring in the ideas that they have and their experiences bring a diversity of thought that would be additive to what we're experiencing today on the team? And do they have the right energy? Are they a good match? Is there compatibility? And what do they care about? And how can I commit to hearing them through
Right.
their own lens and their own way of looking at the world and not through mine. And so the opportunity to assess the personality of the individual and what they will bring, I think, is another important way you can use archetype in
Hmm.
the hiring process. It's one
Yeah.
of the reasons that we've developed our individual assessment, where you can use that tool to understand who each individual human being is.
Mm. And not to say that, we should have a job description that says only heroes need
You
apply,
apply,
right?
right?
Because we're not using it to sort people
Right.
out or discriminate against specific, archetype, but we are using it. Yeah, one of the things we hear often is like, I can go deeper faster, right? If I know, for example, one of Teresa's archetype patterns is magician, right? Do you mind that I share that?
No.
One of her top patterns is magician. So I know that in many times, if I'm listening to Teresa at through that lens, what I'll see and I'll hear is her motivation to drive a vision, to move towards a new reality. And it comes across in how she works, in how she expresses herself, in her ideas. And so when we give hiring managers, we give them a tool that allows them to listen
Right.
more deeply for motivation, for strength, for that diversity. You know, DEI is obviously a huge
That is huge.
conversation
Yeah.
that's
And
happening
yeah,
right now.
absolutely. And as it should be.
And there's so many layers to that, right? There's so many different layers to how did things get to be the way they are systematically in different in every country and every hiring
Right.
experience.
And I think the
But
default sometimes, the easy thing for people and companies to do is to create, measurements in boxes.
mhm.
And so first inclination is to check the boxes. Have we tried? Have we hired? Who's on our team? Check, check,
Yeah.
check. Like everybody fits into a nice little box. Boy,
Yeah.
we're doing it.
Yeah, right, but maybe not, right? Also, I think it's, often math, right? We're
Right.
counting how many things. But how do you do that at a deeper level that lets us actually connect on as human beings through story? That's the
Story.
way that some of the
Exactly.
pieces we're dealing with is kind of, how do I use my story as a way to not only get hired in here, but once I'm hired in here, to connect with you on a human to human level, to
Right.
have an appreciation that, oh, you're not perfect, I'm not perfect, we bring a diversity of background, idea, motivation.
Experiences. Right.
And
Absolutely.
one word that comes to mind for me, is, you know our stories allow us to develop a little bit more compassion for each other,
Mhm.
a little bit more tolerance, perhaps, when we begin to see individual human stories and how people
Right. And
show
I
up
think,
as a full package every day with all of the experiences that they've had, and
yeah.
it's a
And
different
I think
it's a
appreciation
different
as well, because
Mhm.
if you have your ears closed, you're just experiencing what you might find, maybe at first to be annoying or challenging. But when you open your ears to understand the point of view and the unique approach this person brings, all of a sudden you might recognize what you weren't able to see before and appreciate that that's exactly what we need. And I was just so busy driving over you,
Yeah,
um,
I don't see
that
that,
I
so
I
move it
didn't
out of the way.
recognize the gift you were bringing to our
Mm,
team, to our project. And so that's also, I think, the first one of the first things is awareness, as you said at the beginning of this conversation, awareness and appreciation for the
mm,
differences that we each bring.
mm. So, let's go back to the beginning because we're going to wrap here. I hope, if you've tuned in, that you've gotten a little bit, little ideas around what is this thing we call culture, and what are all the different layers? Why is it about not just developing The shared experience, what is it about culture that is also about developing the leaders, developing the teams, and kind of the interactivity, right? Culture is a system. It's an in and out. It's evolving all of the time. So how can we make those things tangible so that they become something we can scale, something we can sustain, something we can brand, something we can use to hire, recruit, retain,
and share that message.
Yeah. So
making it easy to share that message. Yeah.
So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining us. We are live almost every Thursday at 11 Eastern. We'd love to see you. If you've enjoyed this, reach out, follow, share, join us.
Yeah, and send along any additional questions that we can answer for you in a future session. We look forward to connecting.
Have a great weekend.